Hello, my American Studies 140 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins coming to you with another video summary lecture for this time what would be for somewhere between weeks 10 and 12 in the full term course, week 5 for the summer version of this course, giving you details about the suburbanization around the D.C. and the DMV and immigrant Washington, D.C., pretty much in the years after about 1950 or 1960, depending on how far back you want to go. So that's what we're doing today. Whether you are in the summer course or in the course for the regular school year, either fall or spring term, the truth is that at this point in the course you have had moved into the mode of having written at least one, probably even two term papers and or working on a project or a project proposal. So thank you for those who've been turning in your assignments and getting on top of those assignments and being on time with those. And if you're not on time with those, getting those done as soon as you possibly can with the best possible effort you can put in at the same time. So there's that. But most of what I'm going to do today is specifically around talking about the DC and the DMV as we know it in modern terms, right? Cosmopolitan, international, a place where there's, for lack of a better way of putting it, a melting pot of different cultures, not just white Washington or black Washington, which has been the majority of the course, which makes sense because those are the two biggest groups in D.C. and have been pretty much since its founding. Now in D.C., we're at a place that maybe 47, 48% of the population is black. So blacks in D.C., black Washingtonians are still a plurality of the population, if not a majority, where about 40% of the population is white, and that's a pretty big increase from the period since about 1960, 1970, when blacks had been 70% of the population of D.C. But the biggest growth isn't with black Washington or even with white Washington. It's with Latinx Washington. It's with African black Washington, right? It's with groups of folks who are not from the U.S. who've come to move in the city and established families, had kids of their own, who've become adults, and who've made the DMV and D.C. proper their home. And the two issues here are about immigration and suburbanization. Those are the other processes that have shaped the DMV as we know it today, not just gentrification. We focus so much on gentrification, not only in this course, but in terms of the actual average American university student's perception of D.C., everything is around gentrification, that we forget part of the reason why gentrification is received the way it is in D.C., the way it is in the DMV, is because there's a substantial number of people who live in the suburbs around here. There's a substantial number of people who are not originally from the United States who live around here. And so that helps shape and mold how gentrification happens in terms of the movement of people in and out of the city and in and around the surrounding suburbs. So I'll start with suburbanization because we kind of left off with that in terms of how D.C. became Chocolate City in the 1960s and 1970s. White flight from D.C. into Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Howard County, Frederick County, and Maryland side, and on the Virginia side, Fairfax County, Arlington County, City of Alexandria, and other suburban areas in Northern Virginia. And that's what shapes D.C. as we know it today. It's interesting to understand that these processes of suburbanization, which took off before 1950, are shaped by the desegregation of public schools in D.C. in the 1950s. As we've already talked about in previous lectures, 10% of D.C.'s white population literally just up and left in a year between 1954 and 1955, when the Bowling v. Sharp decision component of the Brown decision comes down and D.C. public schools desegregates or begins the slow process of integration. White families move out to Virginia, move out to Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland. But that doesn't stop the process. The process keeps going well into the 60s. literally a third of D.C.'s white population moves out of D.C. in the period between 1950 and 1960. 170,000 whites leave D.C. Net loss of 170,000 whites. That continues into the 1960s. But what's interesting is that after 1970, you begin to see the movement of middle-class black Washingtonians out of D.C. as well. They move out into the outlying suburbs. And as blacks become increasingly more middle class in D.C. in the 1970s and 80s, whether they're working for the federal government, whether they're working for private industry, whether they're working for D.C. government when D.C. has its own sort of home rule after 1974, they tend to move out to specific suburbs, like Prince George's County, Maryland, becomes majority black in the period between 1975 and 1990. A substantial number of black Washingtonians leave for Suitland and Oxon Hill and Landover, Maryland, and Largo, and all these other small towns and small cities in Greenbelt and other parts of Prince George's County, turning the county into about 55, 56, upper 50 percentile black by 1990. And that changes the dynamics of public services in the county, policing in the county, and other kinds of issues that Prince George's County faces around public schooling itself, right? Some people would say this is because blacks are now running the county, which would be a pretty racist thing to say, of course, but a lot of it is really around the dynamic of race, right? In a county that used to be majority white that's now majority black, there might be some racist animosity between blacks who've moved in and the whites who are used to being in a county that's majority white. That's the one exception to the general rule of what happens suburbanization in D.C. Because we're talking about black Washingtonians moving to Prince George's County and sort of making it a suburban county of their own. With Montgomery County, Maryland, with Arlington County, Virginia, with Frederick County, Maryland, with Fairfax County, Virginia, and other places, that's not really the case. Until the mid-1970s, these counties are what we would consider lily white, meaning that they're at least 90% white. At one point in time, in Montgomery County, the county was 96% white. 96%. Arlington County was more than 90% white. Fairfax County was 92% white well into the 1970s. And all those counties had to go through consent decree in order to desegregate their public schools as middle-class blacks started moving in, because their schools are segregated residentially, what's known as de facto segregation for those of you who know Latin, or otherwise the segregation through where people decided to live. And so they desegregated through busing and other means, and there was a lot of protests in the 70s around that, but that sort of gets settled out, and those counties become increasingly diverse in the 80s and 90s as well. And you cannot talk about the diversity of those counties, not only through middle-class black movements from out of D.C. into suburbs like Silver Spring, Maryland, and Fairfax County, Virginia, and Rockville, Maryland, and Germantown, and Potomac, Maryland, and also, as well as other parts of Arlington County, Bailey's Crossroads, for instance, Burke, Virginia, which is in Fairfax County, the city of Alexandria itself, but none of that really gets fully shaped just by black Washingtonians leaving D.C. for the suburbs. That's also shaped in large measure by immigration. And here's the interesting thing. When you talk about suburbanization in the DMV, suburbanization around D.C., suburbanization in the context of both white flight and later middle-class black flight, and even as that's happening, immigrants leaving D.C. for the suburbs, certainly by the 1990s. It brings up a theme for me that's more to my heart. This is a question I've been asking myself since coming down here to do dissertation research in 1993, 1994, 1995, even before me and my family moved down here to live in 1999, and that's this. Why does the food in D.C. suck so bad, suck so hard? Why is it that you can't, there aren't eateries that you can go to where you can find really good food to eat? A deli that, or a bodega that sells, good ham on rye, or, nice pulled pork sandwich, or, just can make a bologna sandwich that tastes good. Can't find that around here. Everything's either, chic and typical Americana food that's dry and unseasoned or whatnot. The Italian food sucks. Pizza sucks. Gyros suck. Whatever you think is good food from wherever you happen to be that's from outside of the DMV tends to be mediocre to really freaking bad around here. And part of that is because part of what makes American food as good as it can be in cities that are more like New York or Philadelphia or even Pittsburgh or some of the older cities, Detroit, Chicago, is because of the influx of people from other parts of the world that brought their culinary skills with them to these areas. And the truth is that while the U.S. itself is a nation of immigrants, D.C. is not made up of large groups of immigrants prior to the 1970s. Immigration in D.C. really as a phenomenon does not take off until really after 1970. That's not to say there are no immigrants came to D.C., but even at the height of immigration in the United States, in the period between roughly 1870 and 1920, when some 33 million people came to U.S. shores and 26 million people ultimately stayed, coming from places like Ireland and what's now Germany, particularly Bavaria, German Catholics coming here, Greeks and Italians, Italianos, and Spaniards and Croats and Czechs and Poles and Polish Jews and German Jews and Russian Jews and Russians, and a host of other groups from Southern and Eastern Europe. And you want to expand it and throw in folks coming from mainland China and Taiwan as a result of the Chinese Civil War that happened between 1850 and 1864, them coming here in the 1860s, 70s, and early 1880s, before the Chinese Exclusion Act shuts off Chinese immigration into the United States. Even when you account for all of that, D.C. only takes in a net of 29,000 total foreign-born Americans in the same period of time that we're talking about. 29,000. The population of D.C. at this point is somewhere around 330,000 by the 1920s and 30s, but you only have maybe 10% of the population is immigrant, whereas the rest of the population in the U.S., it's anywhere between 20% and a third of the U.S. population being immigrant-born, foreign-born. That's a stark contrast, and that's partly because D.C. is the nation's capital. It's not an industrial. There is not a lot of industry in D.C. You can make bricks and carve out stone so that you can build monuments, to be sure. And the Italian immigrants that came to D.C. who helped build the Lincoln Memorial, who helped build Grant's Memorial, who helped build the other buildings that eventually become part of Monument D.C. They numbered about 3,000 total people, right, living in Swamp Poodle and around the area between Chinatown and where the National Mall is in the period of time in the early 20th century, and clashed often with the handful of Greeks and a handful of Irish that also lived in this part of D.C. near the nation's capital, Swamp Doodle. It's in your lecture notes. So at its height, there might have been 3,000 Jews living in D.C. in the middle of the 19th century, right, to establish the first Jewish private schools in Georgetown and first synagogues in D.C. At its height, there might have been 300 Greeks living in D.C. in the early 20th century to open up a couple of mom-and-pop restaurants and stores. But otherwise, they're a small group. There's not a lot of immigration from Europe or from Asia to where immigrants come to the U.S. and go, hey, let's go to D.C. And then it's in part because this is a southern town. It's a white and black town. And if you're going to employ cheap labor, you're going to employ cheap labor that knows English in all likelihood, you're going to employ black folk before you employ these other folk for unskilled labor, which means you either establish a store or a restaurant or some other business, or you go to work for the federal government, and those are your choices if you're an immigrant. And if you do know English, and a lot of second-generation Jews were fairly quick in learning English, then yes, you can come to D.C. and find work in the federal government. If you are not someone who knows English well and who can do skilled work as an accountant or as a carpenter or as a blacksmith in the early 20th century, some sort of thing that required skilled labor or just general white-collar skills, then you're probably not moving here. And if you do move here, you're going to be sort of on the back end of things economically speaking. So there's that. So it's the 70s that this really takes off. And what makes it take off is quirky as far as D.C. is concerned. It's the reality that the established D.C. being the center of the free world at this point, with the U.S. being a superpower, with the U.S. being this powerful player on the world stage, sort of influencing what happens in other countries, is invariably the reason why certain groups of people end up coming here, right? If there is no Ethiopian embassy and consulate in D.C. in the 1960s and 70s, you don't have the influx of Ethiopians coming to D.C. in the 70s and 80s and 90s. If there's no establishment with Salvadoran embassy for El Salvador in D.C., there's no influx of Salvadorans coming to D.C. in the 70s, 80s, and 90s either. And that's really key. D.C. being this place that takes in other people because its relationship with the world has changed to the point where it is considered a leader of the so-called free world, and as such, it has a responsibility taking groups of people who states are failing or fail or somehow have fallen apart as a result of either direct U.S. influence or U.S. and Soviet Union conflict known as the Cold War, directly or indirectly, and these states becoming part of these proxy wars that the U.S. and USSR happen to be fighting in the 60s and 70s. This is certainly the case in the case of Ethiopia, and why you see this movement of Ethiopians to D.C. in the 1970s and 80s. When Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, dies in the early 1970s, military junta takes over. And it starts oppressing whole groups of people who don't want the junta there, which then leads to civil war. A civil war that crosses into what's now Eritrea, and a civil war that Somalia eventually participates in, and an invasion of eastern Ethiopia in the late 1970s. It causes this mass influx of Ethiopians out of Ethiopia into other parts of the world, particularly the U.S. Many of them settle here because the U.S. gives asylum, political and general asylum, to these refugees coming out of Ethiopia. That's how little Ethiopia gets started. And with incentive, some of these Ethiopians come to the States, and come to D.C. specifically, and establish businesses in what's now U Street Shaw, right? There's a reason why there are Ethiopian restaurants on U Street. There's a reason why there are Ethiopian restaurants in Columbia Heights and in Adams Morgan and in Mount Pleasant and other parts of D.C. So that's how they get here. The same thing happens with El Salvador. Our involvement in El Salvador, for ill or for good, leads to a civil war in the late 70s and early 80s and drives a lot of Salvadorans out of El Salvador, and into the United States. And several thousand of them, 10,000 as a matter of fact, moved here in a period of time between the late 70s and the early 90s. Just as much as 10,000 Ethiopians gradually moved their way to D.C. in the period between 1974 and about 1995 or 96. 5,000 or more settle here, and a bunch eventually settle in other parts of the DMV. The group Salvadorans end up settling mostly in Columbia Heights, opening up restaurants and shops selling pupusas and other things, and they establish their community that way. Both groups have their own version of suburbanization as well. As gentrification starts taking over, as rents start increasing, as property values start increasing, people realize that they cannot make a profit with restaurants on U Street and Shaw or in Columbia Heights alone. So many of those groups, and the later influx of those groups from those countries, move into the suburbs of Washington, D.C. So they'll end up moving to Silver Spring, Maryland, and Tacoma Park, Maryland. In some cases they move out in Prince George's County. Some of them move east of the Potomac into Anacostia. So the second largest group of non-black, non-white folks living in Wards 7 and 8 are Salvadorans, right, for instance. You also have folks moving to the city of Alexandria. You have folks moving, who are Ethiopian, who are Salvadoran, moving into parts of Arlington, parts of Fairfax County as well. You see these patterns also with other groups as well. You have a large group of Vietnamese who live in Fairfax County. There are a lot of people who swear the best Vietnamese food that you can find outside of Vietnam is in Fairfax County, Virginia. Shouldn't be surprised that there's a fairly large group of Vietnamese Americans living in Fairfax County. There's a large group of Koreans who've moved out into suburbs of Montgomery County, Maryland as well. And you can do this for other groups if you want to trace Nigerians and Cameroonians and where they live in D.C. and their out-migration to Montgomery County, Prince George's County, city of Alexandria. You can do the same with them as well. What does that mean in terms of overall suburbanization and immigration to D.C.? D.C.'s population is basically roughly 1 out of every 7 Washingtonians is immigrant-born, primarily from El Salvador and primarily from Ethiopia, but there are all these other groups of sub-Saharan Africa. There are all these other groups of Central South America. There are a variety of groups in smaller numbers from East Asia and Southeast Asia and South Asia. But yes, you have fairly large numbers of immigrants in D.C., about 100,000 out of the population of roughly 700,000. But what's more interesting is with suburban Maryland and suburban D.C. in general, right? The overall population of suburban D.C., if you do not account for Baltimore County and Baltimore City, is 7.2 million people estimated as of 2019. Approximately over 1.1 million of those people are immigrants, 260,000 of whom happen to be from, El Salvador, the children of people who are Salvadoran. 1 out of 4 are from El Salvador. This is the single largest group of Salvadorans outside of basically either Albuquerque, New Mexico, or Los Angeles, who live outside of El Salvador itself. The largest single group of Ethiopians living outside of Ethiopia in the U.S. is in the DMV as well. So this is a city that's truly cosmopolitan due to suburbanization, due to immigration patterns that have been part and parcel of the U.S.'s status as being a superpower, and our status for better and for good, meddling in other countries' processes over the last 70 or 80 years, coming to fruition in the form of Little Ethiopia in D.C. and Little Ethiopias outside of D.C. and the DMV, as well as Salvadoran communities in Columbia Heights and other parts of D.C., as well as throughout the larger DMV as well.